I am very honored to be here. I am very grateful to the Foundation. I'm very grateful to the association. And I'm very grateful to all of you for your time. And I would like to just echo the comment that was just made. You know, interacting in hyperspace will never substitute for being live. And I certainly hope to be live with you in Spain sometime in the next couple of years. It's been too long. All right. So as was said, this is going to be a lecture that's going to be based on my new book, which is called Survival of the City, Living and Thriving in an Age of Isolation. It is joint with David Cutler, my colleague, who's a health economist. And it's really about the two threats that are seen to urban life right now, one of which is the direct health threat. The second threat is one which has been around for much longer. It's the threat of connecting via Zoom, connecting via the internet, and potentially destabilizing the demand for downtown office space. Now, if I were giving this talk in 2019 or earlier, I would begin with a figure such as this one. This shows the relationship between density and earnings across the European Union, across 1,114 NUTS 3 regions. And what you can see from the blue line is that the densest of these NUTS 3 regions have incomes that are about twice as high as the least dense half of NUTS 3 regions. This is, of course, what we all call agglomeration economies, the fact that we become more productive when we're thrown into a maelstrom of economic activity. The red line shows perhaps a slightly more surprising fact, which is the relationship between population growth and initial population densities. And again, this is positive. And it tells us that at the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we're clustering in, or at least we were before COVID. Accompanying urban productivity, accompanying the demand for cities as places of work, is the rise of demand of cities as places of pleasure as well. This map shows the ratio of prices to income across England. And as you can see, the UK area just has a vastly higher price to income ratio, suggesting that it's not just the high wages in London that are pushing up prices, but something else, right? The rise of London as a consumer city, the fact that London is an extraordinarily fun place, as is Barcelona, as is Madrid. These are tremendous urban assets, but of course, they also show up in the downside of a lack of urban affordability, the lack of high prices. So this is where we were in 2019. We had, robust urban economies. We had housing markets that were on the path to recovery after the housing debacle of 15 years ago. And then all of a sudden, right, this happened. We had a return to what is an old companion of urban life. Plague has been around in cities for thousands of years. And of all the downsides of density, it is the most terrible, right? The first well-documented urban plague that we have here is the Plague of Athens, which strikes in, and can everyone see my screen? Is the screen?
Yeah, perfectly.
Perfectly, okay. The Plague of Athens, which strikes in 430 BCE. Now, the backstory for the Plague of Athens is that, this city of the Eastern Mediterranean had really been doing all that you could possibly ask a city to do. It had put together amazing chains of creativity in fields like the arts, architecture, ceramics, in fields like history. History itself was created in Athens by men like Herodotus and Thucydides, in fields like philosophy, mathematics, drama, right? It had given us democracy itself and had enjoyed spectacular success, both militarily and economically. Now, all of this success then engendered the envy of Athens' military rural rival Sparta. And in 430 BC, as Pericles, the leader of the Athenian democracy, refused to give in to Sparta's threats, the Peloponnesian War was on. Now, Pericles had a plan to defeat the superior Spartan army, which was to summon the Athenians and their Attic allies behind the walls of the city, and to trust to those walls to keep out the enemy warriors, and at the same time send forth the Athenian fleet to harass the coast of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, where Sparta was. Perfectly sensible strategy militarily, and yet walls that can keep out a Spartan hoplite can still let in a virus or bacteria. And that is precisely what happened in 430 BCE. Through Athens' port of Piraeus, some form of plague entered. It devastated the city for 2 years. Perhaps 1/4 of the population died. That would be a death rate approximately 100 times the death rate from COVID-19. Thucydides was there. He describes a city that has gone amok, in which people live for the day only. They live for today only because they do not expect to be around tomorrow. It is a destabilizing event. Athens soldiers on. It succeeds for another 25 years in avoiding defeat, but eventually it will lose to Sparta. And in some sense, its glory is forever gone. It moves from being perhaps the New York City of the Mediterranean world to then being the Boston, to then being, I don't know, the New Haven or Cambridge, Massachusetts. In some sense, its glory is forever dimmed. And the plague had so much impact because the situation was unstable to begin with, because there was already a war going on. And that's a central fact about plague history, is that the impact of plagues, like all natural disasters, is mediated by the strength of civil society in the moment in which the plague hits. So the Antonine Plague, 5 centuries after the Plague of Athens, strikes Rome during this period of the so-called 4 good emperors, which, according to the 18th century English historian Edward Gibbon, is, the happiest period in pre-modern life. It was a period of enormous stability, and the Roman Empire, endured this devastating demographic event. Again, huge numbers of people died, but it didn't destabilize. The empire remained strong. In the next century, the Cyprian plague hit at a point in which politics had already become destabilized, much more consequential, perhaps one of the major events that leads to the ultimately unraveling of the Western Roman Empire. Of course, the most severe of our pre-modern plagues was the Plague of Justinian, which hits Constantinople in 541 of the Common Era. The backstory for that is that after the first generation of the Ostrogothic conquerors who had taken over Italy, like, for example, Theodoric the Great, and you can see this is a coin depicting Theodoric, after the first generation had died off and been replaced by their decidedly less impressive descendants, the Eastern Roman Empire remained strong. And so the Emperor Justinian, and you can see Justinian wearing the crown over there in the mosaics, Justinian prepared to send forth his warlord, Belisarius, who's the fellow standing next to him, to reconquer Italy, to reconquer North Africa, and to reimpose the Pax Romana on the Mediterranean world, right? Belisarius does indeed enjoy enormous military success, and yet just at the moment, which seems really possible that, the destruction of the Western Roman Empire can be undone, in which peace can come again, in which urban civilization can return to the Mediterranean, just at that moment, Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, makes its first appearance on European shores in any kind of recorded history. The impact of this is devastating, right? Procopius is there and describes a situation which is, again, mass carnage. Obviously, Belisarius is no longer able to impose peace. The Byzantines that are in Italy become essentially another warring group, not a conqueror bringing peace. And Europe plunges in wave after wave of plague into centuries of darkness, into centuries of rural poverty and war and political chaos. This is the worst case scenario in our past of what a plague can do. Now, for most of the last 650 years, we have been much more stable with respect to plague. The 19th century was an early era of globalization, in which sail ships would traverse the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and they would bring diseases along with them. This shows the history of death rates in New York City over the past 2 centuries. And you can see in the early decades of the 19th century, the big disease is yellow fever. This is a mosquito-borne illness that comes out of Africa, gets carried up to the eastern seaboard in the 18th century, and its kill rates are about 2.5% per annum in the big years. That's about 10 times the kill rates from COVID-19. And then in 1817, cholera emerges out of the Ganges Delta. It travels along with the British Army. It travels along with the Russian Army. It makes its way gradually west, and it shows up in New York City in 1832. Death rates are even higher in 1832 and 1849. It's about 5% of the population, which is about 20 times the death rate from COVID-19. Now, despite these, horrendous episodes of death and disease, New York City continues to grow. And indeed, most pre-modern cities were places of constant death in an age of contagious disease. Why did they keep on growing? First of all, people were just much poorer. And if the alternative was dying of starvation in Ireland or getting on a boat and going to London or New York, lots of people are going to get on a boat and go to London or New York, even if there is the risk of cholera. But even more importantly, the cities of the West invested in their own health. They provide us a model for what may be needed today as we think about dealing with the risks associated with global pandemic. You can see there 1842, Croton Aqueduct opening. Aqueducts and sewers were the most important forms of infrastructure. And the investment on these things was enormously expensive. Right? America's cities and towns were spending as much on water-related infrastructure in 1900 as our national government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. Right? Just an enormous undertaking. But this moment where our cities start investing in health is the moment in which, the hinge of history, in which governments cease to be solely agents of death. And that's pretty much all that our governments did prior to 1800, at least, during the Renaissance to early modern period. We may all, think it's charming that Frederick the Great had a delightful correspondence with Voltaire, but let's not confuse ourselves. The main job of Frederick the Great was fighting Maria Theresa and stealing Silesia, not actually carrying out philosophic correspondence. And yet during this period, governments start to give life as well as to take it. And this is really the story that we tell in the third chapter of our book. It's not just about infrastructure, it's also about incentives as well. And so you can see the Croton Aqueduct, which is the big form of water-related infrastructure, opens in 1842 down here. It's right here. For another 25 years, New York continues to have cholera epidemics. What's going on here? My great-great-great-grandfather died in this one in 1849 of cholera. What's going on is that poor New Yorkers continue to, use their wells. They continue to use boreholes. They continue to use pit latrines. They don't connect to the system. It's exactly the same problem that we see in developing world cities today, where we have some form of a water main which provides clean water, but poor people aren't willing to pay the cost of connection to it because, of course, they're poor. And so they continue to get sick. And it's only when you have the Board of Health, which is, again, itself a major civic undertaking that takes a whole movement led by Dr. Stephen Smith, takes a great deal of research to actually build support for this, that you start imposing taxes on tenement owners who don't connect to the water system. It's only then that New York really starts to see its cholera death rates going down. But of course, for most of the past century, right, our cities have been relatively pandemic-free since the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919. It's been a blessed century, but, all of a sudden in 2020, diseases started emerging, and they started emerging first in cities. This is a map of COVID rates for the US as of April 30, 2020, so this is early on. Same sort of facts show up in Spain, where connections to Madrid end up being a big predictor of COVID case rates early on. There are two reasons why cities are associated with plague. The first of which is cities are the global ports of entry on our lattice of travel and trade. They were in 430 BC when the port of Piraeus was the entry point for whatever plague killed Athens. They were again in 2020 when our cities were the ports of entry for COVID-19. And you can see there that sort of New York, which is the place that's welcoming home tourists coming back from Italy, bringing COVID-19 with them. Then you can see Boston, a single bio conference seeds a huge amount of that. You can see Atlanta, you can see New Orleans, you can see Detroit, right? Cities are the places where this plague spreads. And you can see as of April, this just shows the connection between population density and the COVID case rates as of April. Cities are also prone to spread disease for another reason, which is that we are closer together in cities. If two people are close enough to share a smile face-to-face, they're also close enough to share a disease. And this very proximity also makes diseases more prone to spread within cities, especially when cities are marked by informal settlements like the favelas of Brazil. And this again shows early on the relationship between cases per 100,000 and the share of the population living in a favela, in an informal settlement across Brazil. This shows the relationship between infections per capita and the share of the population living in slums in Indian areas The remarkable serological work of Anup Malani, who actually measured the prevalence of COVID-19 in the blood of slum dwellers in India, found that by July of 2020, so that's a year and a half ago, more than 50% of the residents of Mumbai slums had already been infected by COVID-19. Now, somewhat amazingly, the death rates weren't all that high, which is fairly unusual given that India was perhaps the biggest loser from the plagues of the 19th century because India was infected by globalization, but it didn't get any of the public health investments that were received in London. However, in 2020, COVID-19 ended up being much less deadly in the slums because the slum dwellers were young and they were thin, and they lacked the comorbidities that made COVID so deadly in North and South America in particular. Of course, unlike a waterborne pandemic, an airborne pandemic can go anywhere. And so by November 30, 2020, right, this was a disease that was more common in the Dakotas. In the fall of this year, it was a southern disease, right? Density is no guarantee of illness. Low density is no guarantee of safety. We really see this also within cities. This shows a map of New York City. You can see here, there are the 5 boroughs. I don't know how many of you know the geography of New York. This is the island of Manhattan, where the tallest buildings are. This area over here is Brooklyn Heights, also highly dense. These areas that are brownest are the least dense parts of the city. Staten Island, the Bronx, outer Queens. What's going on here? Why are the most dense places having the fewest cases per capita? This is again as of about June 2020. What's going on is mobility matters far more than living arrangements. It doesn't matter if you live in a tall tower. What matters is if you go out and leave that tower. And this shows, and this is the first pandemic we've ever had in history, which we have good measures of people's mobility during the pandemic, thanks to the cell phone data that companies like SafeGraph and others have made available. And you can really see that in the city center, people stopped moving around. In the outer areas, they changed much less. And it was really movement that predicts the illness. Here you can see over here the relationship between the share of change in trips and the share of cases, right? A very clear effect. Now, what was going on? Why were the people in the inner boroughs, in the densest areas, not moving around, and the people in the outer boroughs moving around? Was it because somehow the inner boroughs people were smarter? No, it had to do with privilege. It had to do with who worked in essential industries. And you can see the people in the essential industries were the ones who had the least reduction in trips. And it had to do with the share of people who worked in industries that allowed telework, mostly industries that were used by skilled knowledge workers. And the people in the inner boroughs were in industries like finance, where they could, or management consulting, where they could all zoom it in. The people who were in the outer boroughs worked in hospitals. They worked in grocery stores. They worked in clinics, and they worked in pharmacies. And those people actually had to go to work to earn their living. And they faced illness as a result. I'm actually not going to talk about this, but our estimates are that a 10% reduction in the number of trips is associated with a 20% reduction in the number of cases. And we do this using an instrumental variables estimate that involves these effects of these industries. We also do this for other cities other than New York, and we find roughly the same thing, which just reminds us how powerful mobility is. Now, while mobility, of course, is incredibly important, it's not obvious that all the rules around mobility were very important. It was often acted as if, it was often stated as if there was a clear decision that governments had to sacrifice either health or sacrifice the economy with lockdowns. Let me just show you a picture of mobility and lockdowns. This is from Pennsylvania. This is by work by Victor Couture, Jonathan Dingle, Jesse Hanbury. You can see here, this is mobility pre-pandemic. Pre-pandemic, the red line is more educated areas. The blue line is less educated areas. Pre-pandemic, more educated people moved around more. This is why some of the earliest cases were very high-profile people, like Tom Hanks, for example, or in my world, the president of Harvard was the first person I knew who got the disease, because nobody takes more meetings than the president of Harvard. Now, immediately after the state of emergency, and this was not a regulation, this was just an announcement, you can see mobility drops dramatically, right? They dropped dramatically before the rules, not after the rules. Okay, then the business closures were put in place. Okay, there you have a little bit more of a reduction, but it's not obvious that the trend breaks. And then finally, you have the most draconian rule, okay, which is shelter-in-place laws. The shelter-in-place laws do nothing to mobility. It was fear that caused people to stop moving, not the rules themselves. Now, it was possible that some of the decisions to open up businesses got rid of the fear, okay, and got people moving around again. We saw this in states like Texas and Florida in the early months of the pandemic, where they reopened things, where people seem to have, understood this reopening as a all clear sign. they went out again after those regulations were ended, but they rapidly stopped going out again because they got sick. Fear, again, is more important than the rules. Now, one of the reasons why I fear this, pandemic hit and then the associated hit of the remote working is there were strong urban weaknesses that had been appearing. There were fissures in the urban space that emerged over the last 20 years. And one way of thinking about this is that in 2021, when terrorists hit cities in 2001, when terrorists hit the Twin Towers and other cities, including Spain, and later, including Madrid, I felt fairly confident that our urban areas were going to survive this because they felt so united, because they felt so much as if, there was a recognition that we're all in this together. Over the past 20 years, it's not so much that cities have become more unequal, although they have. It's that the inequality of cities, which, remember, is an old feature of urban life. I mean, it was Plato who wrote in the Republic that every city of whatever size is in reality two cities. One, a city of the rich, the other, a city of the poor, and they are perpetually at war with one another. But that inequality is tolerable when cities are providing opportunities for poorer people to become richer people. And yet, over the past 20 years, it's become obvious that cities are bringing productivity, but not upward mobility for kids, at least in the US. Our successful cities are becoming permanently unaffordable, partially because we erect rules that protect insiders at the expense of outsiders. We have seen a rise of permanent pain, rising joblessness in some parts of America, partially because people can't get out and move to our more productive cities. And of course, especially in the US, there's deep unhappiness over policing and incarceration. I would just show a few things. This data comes from the Opportunity Atlas that Raj Chetty, Nathan Hendren, and their co-authors have put together. On the left-hand side, you can see the relationship between population density and productivity per person, output per person. On the right-hand side, you can see the relationship between upward mobility and density. What this upward mobility means is they look at people born between 78 and 82, and they ask, where are they in the income distribution today if their parents were at the 25th percentile of the income distribution in 1980, i.e. their parents are poorer than 3/4 of other adults in that year. And what you can see is the least dense metropolitan areas have the highest upward mobility. They end up in the 45th percentile. In the most dense areas, they end up in the 39th percentile. This looks within cities. That was across metropolitan areas. This looks within cities. Again, as density goes up, you see upward mobility drop. And as distance from the city center goes up, you see upward mobility rise. So it's sort of the exact opposite of what we see for adults, where adults are, see wage gains when they come to city. It's not just that they experience an immediate boost of wages. Year by year, month by month, they experience faster wage growth. This is best shown by Spanish data by the remarkable work of De La Roca and Puga, who look at migrants, which is based on at least partially earlier work of mine looking at migrants in the US and documenting this faster wage growth in cities. Not for kids. And in the US, part of the problem is the central city school districts. And here you can see the jump up in mobility just at the edge of central city school districts. This is averaging across the US. And over here on the right-hand side, this is the jump down in your probability of being incarcerated in jail or prison as an adult right at the edge of a central city school district. Now, what's going on? This comes from new work of mine looking at cell phones that we've tried to attribute to adults and students. When you see this just looks across metropolitan areas and density. In more dense areas, adults become more exposed to people who are different than them. Kids do not. And if you just think about a poor kid growing up in a barrio in Mexico City or in a slum in New York, those poor kids are going to, they wake up, they're going to play with other poor kids, and they're going to go to school in a highly segregated school full of poor kids, right? By contrast, the adults who wake up in a poor area of Boston or New York or Madrid will often go to jobs that are in a rich area of the city and will actually interact with other people. And that's part of how income mobility home works. You can see over here that as density goes up, adults spend less time at home. Kids spend more time at home. As density goes up, adults spend more time at work. Kids spend less time at school. And so density is having a very different effect on the experience of kids and the experience of adults. Problem number two, pre-existing mobility, pre-existing affordability problems. So high cost of space. This partially reflects the demand for cities, as I suggested at the beginning of this lecture, but it also reflects limitations that cities have artificially put on their own supply of housing. What you can see here across the US is this shows the housing supply between 2000 and 2013 divided by the initial housing stock. This shows the difference between the price of housing and the cost of building a house. So a number like 3 means it costs 3 times as much to buy a house than it does to build a house. So it's a measure of sort of excess costliness of being in the city. What this shows you is that cities that build a lot aren't expensive, and cities that are expensive don't build a lot. There's no repealing the laws of supply and demand. And if you're going to have land use restrictions that make it very difficult to build, whether or not that's in New York or London or Paris, then you're going to risk creating a boutique town that is affordable only to the wealthy and does not make space for poor people to come and find opportunity. This just shows the relationship between one of the indices of land use regulation and housing prices. And what's happened as we have locked people out of our successful cities is people have become locked into places which have permanently high levels of joblessness. What this shows is the relationship between the share of the population at the public use microsample area, so these are small regions within the US, the share of the male population that was not working in 1980, and the share of the male population that was not working in 2020. A strong positive relationship, a coefficient that's more than 1, so it's explosive, and a correlation coefficient that's over 80%, right? This is perpetual joblessness, right? This is not the dynamic America of the post-war years. This is an America that has become frozen, partially because jobless men, over a third of them in the US, live with their parents. I don't know the fact for Spain, but it's probably quite similar, right? Now, their parents aren't going to provide them with an apartment in New York or San Francisco. They're going to keep them in their house in Eastern Kentucky, and so they're going to stay jobless in those areas. The final issue, which is a very America-specific issue, is we had enormous crime problems in our cities in the 1980s, enormous murder problems. We dealt with them with fairly brutal policing and by locking up millions of young men. On one level, the safety of cities like New York and Chicago and Boston were urban miracles, were urban triumphs that made the city's other successes possible. But at the same time, we did so in such a brutal and often stupid manner that there was always going to be a backlash. There was always going to be an unhappiness about just how much we had, how much pain we had caused in the quest to make our cities safer. Now, this pandemic is a particular danger to cities because it's also an economic shock for 2 reasons. One of which is in the short run, it imperils our new urban model. So if you think about pandemics through history and the interaction between pandemics and the economy, if you go back to the 1350, when the Black Death shows up in Europe for the second time, and it kills off about a third of the European population, again, a devastating demographic and human disaster. But it's not an economic disaster for the people who remain. Because in an agricultural economy, wealth is determined by land per capita. And when the population drops by 1/3, land per capita goes up by 50%. And so wages soared after the Black Death. The people who remained were much richer. And in a sense, right, it is a plausible hypothesis that, in fact, the rising wealth of the people who survived the Black Death led for the demand for luxury goods that then fueled the urban renaissance of the 15th century. Flash forward to the industrial economy of 1918, 1919. The remarkable work of Francois Veld of the Chicago Fed gives us the best, fine-grained view of what happened during this pandemic. This is a pandemic that causes a sharp economic dislocation immediately. Factories shut down, mines shut down. And yet the industrial economy keeps on humming and it recovers fairly quickly because just as we have found during this pandemic, demand for goods remains robust in the pandemic. People didn't stop buying ice boxes or Model T Fords during the influenza pandemic, just as they have not stopped buying televisions and refrigerators today. But over the last 100 years, factories have outsourced, factories have automated, and our less skilled workers have moved from industry to services, where the ability to serve a cappuccino with a smile has been an employment safe haven, despite the rise of robots and massive machines in factories. And yet those jobs, those urban service sector jobs, 32 million Americans worked in them in 2019, 1/5 of the employed labor force. Those jobs can vanish in a heartbeat when those smiles become a source of peril rather than a source of pleasure. And so it was. Now, the second economic shock is the rise of remote work. Now, overall in the US, most of Americans who were remote at the peak have gone back to work. So in 2020, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics data, 50 million Americans were remote in May 2020. Over the last year and a half, more than 60% of those have gone back. Today, less than 20 million Americans have gone remote. But this is not true in our highest end office markets. This is a somewhat strange sample. This comes from a company called Castle, which does security systems for companies. And so they do for all these buildings, they do this sort of key swab system where you swipe a card, or you swipe a key swab to get into the building. And so that key swab data gives you a measure of occupancy. And what you can see here is that occupancy dropped in some cases by 95% when the plague struck. But in some areas, and you can see New York and San Francisco are at the bottom, according to their data, 80% of these offices are still not reoccupied. Now, the threat of disease has not gone away. So this is not a post-pandemic statement, but we do really wonder whether or not, this information technology will make face-to-face contact in the cities that enable that contact obsolete. Now, this is not the first time people have asked this question. Feels like I've been talking about this question for my entire professional life. Let's say that's about a third of a century. I date, the first major person who posed this hypothesis is Alvin Toffler, the futurist, who wrote a book called The Third Wave, which argued that the rise of information technology would make urban offices obsolete, just as earlier technologies had made urban manufacturing obsolete. He was writing in a centrifugal age for cities. He was writing in an age in which cars and radios and televisions had induced people to leave from dense urban areas. They had killed off older urban industries. He was initially a New Yorker, and New York possessed the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s, garment production, guys like this making and shipping clothes. And yet, the garment sector was slaughtered by globalization in the 60s and early 70s. Hundreds of thousands of jobs were lost quickly. And so naturally, Toffler asked, if cars and highways killed urban industry, why won't these, information technology of the 1980s, why won't these kill urban office workers? Why wouldn't they kill the knowledge workers? And yet, for most of the last 40 years, his dire predictions about empty skyscrapers were completely and totally wrong. And I think what he missed is that what globalization and new technologies did was they radically increased the returns to being smart. And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. These are two images I like to use to connote this, one of which is an image of Michael Bloomberg's City Hall in New York, which is based on the City Hall, based on the Wallace office in his company, which is based on a trading floor that he used to run at Solomon Brothers, a Wall Street financial firm. In a sense, trading floors are something of a puzzle. They're highly crowded, they're highly dense, they're without walls, and yet their workers are incredibly rich. What's going on there? Why do trading floors exist? Why was Jamie Dimon so eager to get his traders back onto their floors in the fall of 2020? They're there because there's no industry in which knowing a little bit more information can make you richer faster than trading. It is a very knowledge-intensive industry that works on very rapid-fire knowledge. And so the cues that you get from being in the same room are just really, really valuable. In a sense, trading floors are there because in that industry, knowledge is more important than space. And that's ultimately why cities came back as well. The most famous geographic cluster of the 21st century is precisely in the industry that should have been able to do long-distance work the most, Silicon Valley. And yet Google, which certainly was an entity that could have done everything remotely, Google didn't send its workers home before COVID. Google bought the Googleplex. Google crammed its workers together. Google, like many tech companies, tried to create a playground at work where people wanted to be around each other all the time because it believed that's how creativity works. Okay. And so before COVID-19, we had facts like this. This just shows across zip codes in New York City, the extraordinary connection between employee density and productivity, per capita payroll. This shows that it's not all cities that managed to come back after the deindustrialization of the 1970s. It was educated cities. And that's sort of a key fact about why cities have remained important is that density, proximity complements skills. Because people who are skilled have more to teach each other and require new information the most. This shows the relationship between skills in 2000 and subsequent population growth across counties. And this shows the equivalent poverty of low density areas in 2015. So this shows the share of prime age men who are not working. You can see in coastal areas, there are very respectable rates of joblessness. It's very rare. And less skilled people do work in these great urban service sectors, which I was confident urban entrepreneurs would figure out what people without a degree from MIT could do in the 21st century. But I had no idea what they would do in the low density parts of Europe or the low density parts of the US, where some parts of joblessness are over 25%. Now, what do we know on data from COVID? I'll give you a couple of different data points here. So first of all, this is Emmanuel and Harrington. They look at a large American retailer going remote for its call center workers. This is actually pre-pandemic data, but they then also looked at this post-pandemic. Their work echoes an earlier study by Nicholas Bloom of Stanford, who did an extraordinary randomized controlled trial where they sent Chinese call center workers home. Both studies have exactly the same two facts. When you send call center workers home, they do not become less productive. Okay, they can make just as many calls in an hour at home as they can live. Okay, but, and here's the important fact, both studies find that the probability of being promoted to an upper level job, and you can see that there, this is this probability of being promoted to an upper level job, falls in half. Okay, both studies find exactly the same thing. Now, what does it mean to get promoted to an upper level job for a call center worker? Well, it means you get asked to handle the difficult calls. It means you get to handle the customers who are really a pain in the neck. How would you learn how to handle difficult calls if you were by yourself? How would your boss learn that you were good at handling them? We've shut down the learning channel by their going remote, and consequently, they're not building human capital in the same way. They're lacking what the great English economist Alfred Marshall wrote about when he talked about how in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade are no mystery, but are in the air, right? Nothing's in the air when you're working remotely. Similar fact. This divides up, this is work by Jose Ramon Morales Aria and Carlos Dabuin. I would be remiss, in fact, right now to point out Jose Ramon is actually on the job market right now, and he is very eager to find employment in a Spanish university. But this comes from their work on working remotely. So from this, you can see that on one side, on the left-hand side, you see non-remotable jobs. These declined sharply at the start of the pandemic. And so do postings. Postings are from Burning Glass Technology. That's pretty much the universe of online job wanted ads in the US. And so the postings drop dramatically, and so do the hires, and then they both come back. By contrast, remotable jobs, the employment is steady. Employment drops by much less, but postings collapse and they stay down. What's going on here? What's going on here is that companies are very wary of hiring new workers who will not come into the office. They're very wary of losing that learning process, which comes from face-to-face contact. They're very wary of onboarding workers entirely remotely. And so while old relationships can be maintained via Zoom, it's much harder to create new relationships. And I can tell you just in terms of our cohort of graduate students, the difference between last year, which was almost, it felt very disconnected, and they still feel disconnected, relative to this year's cohort who are live and next to each other, is night and day. And of course, another fact that goes along with this is this fact that, remote school, and we have randomized controlled trials on this, remote school has been somewhere between disaster and counterproductive for younger students, right? The ability to teach via Zoom is very, very limited. Adding to these facts are the facts that, we have much more. It is very hard for many of us to enjoy work when we're remote. The issue of Zoom fatigue has been a very real thing. And there's great work by Microsoft researchers, which shows that post-pandemic, there have been a substantial decline in new relationships being formed and a substantial decline in synchronous communication, meaning people are communicating only with lags. They're not actually connecting with each other with the richer form of real-time communication. A final issue, if you imagine the future is going to be remote, is that future is going to be even more unequal than the recent past. This shows what happened to employment at the height of the remote work moment in 2020, May 2020. The first couple columns show the share of people who are unemployed. The next set of columns show the share of people who are teleworking. I want you to focus on those. If you look just at those people who have advanced degrees, 68.9% of those people with advanced degrees were teleworking as of May 2020. 59.6% of people who had a bachelor's degree or higher were teleworking. By contrast, only 5% of people with less than a high school degree were teleworking. Only 15% of people who had no college were teleworking. Okay, so it's a very different world. It's a very unequal world. And this connects back with what I had said earlier about this very different experience of different parts of New York, that remote work was very much an elite thing. And if our future is remote, it's a world for elite workers, not for other people. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think that remote work is a real thing. It doesn't mean that I don't think there'll be hybrids. It doesn't mean that I don't think that there are some companies that will just relocate because of this. Okay. So for example, if you think about your, Silicon Valley tech startup, I think it is very unlikely that they're going to say, oh, we never need to meet again in person. That is just so different from the model of, highly intense personal interactions that had been part of these companies' existence beforehand. But they may decide they don't want to pay Silicon Valley rents anymore. And so they relocate to Texas because they don't want to pay state taxes. They relocate to Colorado because they want to ski. They relocate to Hawaii because they want to surf. And so global talent has just become more mobile. Now, this is in the long run a huge asset for Spain, which of course has cities, has towns, which are global magnets for, their consumer cities, their places of pleasure. And so that is sort of an upside to think about. Now, when I think about things going forward, I think that the long run impact of cities is going to depend on medical response, right? So, if we have many more years of, Delta getting worse, if more people end up dying from this stuff, COVID-19 may itself become more difficult to live with in terms of density. I think even worse would be another pandemic which emerges, which is deadlier, right? We have been, prior to this, we have been far too lackadaisical about pandemic risk. We had warning signs, we had SARS, we had MERS, we had H1N1, and rich countries did very, very little. The WHO is just not enough. We need to have a much more muscular global alliance to fight pandemic. Even if we do make these investments, even if we do become more pandemic proof as a global society, right, the shock is still real to cities. I don't think it's going to change urban life massively, but there will be short-term shifts. Commercial space is more vulnerable than residential space. Young people are still very eager to go back to cities, even though they're not eager to go back to the offices. But we're going to see cities reallocate from old to young. Remote work will continue. And finally, of course, global talent has just gotten more mobile, and yet there's a dire need to help the urban disadvantaged. So in order to fight inequality, we need smarter government rather than more or less government. We need fewer regulations that bind small businesses or builders, and we need a constant need to experiment and evaluate. We need to have the humility to learn. Just as a reminder, those markets that started with very high office rents, my prediction is that they'll see their office rents lower, but they will not see long-term vacancies. Those markets that started with very low office rents, they could have vacancies, and those vacancies will spill over to other areas because there'll be a lot of demand for urban service workers who are nearby. I just want to finally end with these two images of Berlin from 1945 and today. Yes, this has been a tough time for cities, but cities have been through much worse than this, and they've recovered. They are fundamental to humanity because our greatest talent as a species is our ability to learn with, to work with, to bond with other human beings. And cities make that possible. And anyone who's ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing subject material, it's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through. Face-to-face contact enables us to communicate to each other in ways that it's just not possible long distance. So we have substantial work ahead. We have to create cities that are more vulnerable to pandemic and cities that are places of greater opportunity for everyone. But I believe that cities have been working miracles for thousands of years, since at least the time when Socrates and Plato bickered on an Athenian street corner. And I believe at the same time that the age of urban miracles is not over. Thank you very much for including me in your conference.